Thank you. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our session on day one of Financial Inclusion Week. The CFI team does such an amazing job with this event. Thank you to Natasha, Jayshree, and the entire CFI team. I've already really enjoyed the opening session and some of the other morning sessions. My name is Erica Yerkes, and I serve as Vice President for Resource Development at Accion. I'm joined today by four special leaders representing a diversity of perspectives in the funding space. And in the next 45 minutes, we will discuss navigating volatile markets and harnessing the capital needed to reach 1.3 billion people who are excluded from the global financial system. I think everyone would agree that we could probably convene an entire week dedicated to this subject alone, especially during this current environment. It can feel daunting. But I can't help but think of the now ubiquitous phrase, if not now, then when? And so we will do our best to unpack some of the challenges and identify opportunities and solutions. A brief introduction of our panelist. Anne Estope is Data and Market Intelligence Manager at Timeo Impact Fund Solutions, where she oversees research projects on impact investing in emerging and frontier markets. She is responsible for Timeo's flagship report on private asset impact funds, providing insights to investors and development finance actors on capital flows for inclusive finance. Emmanuel Javois leads CGAP's technical agenda on blended finance, focusing on optimizing the use of blended finance instruments to advance financial inclusion and achieve development outcomes such as women's empowerment, climate change mitigation, food security, SME development, and job creation. Liz Stern is the founder of Global Giving Advisors, where she guides individuals, corporates, and foundations through a structured, practical, and goal-oriented program that places clients' desires at the forefront. And a fun fact about Liz is that she has traveled to 90 countries, although that might be outdated. Is it more than 90?
It's about 110, 108.
Okay. All right. Amazing. And Liz has traveled to both India and Ethiopia to visit Accion partners and clients, and we're so fortunate to have her in our court. And last but certainly not least, and bringing both the consumer and MFI perspective, is Medha Wilson. Medha is the Group CEO of Microloan Foundation, a leading MFI working across Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and now South Africa. And best wishes are in order to her team today. They are finalists this week in the publicinterestregistry.org Impact Awards. So good luck and welcome to all the panelists. A few words to the audience, to everyone joining, a reminder to kindly put questions and comments in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to some of those during the discussion and then at the end as time allows. And just a few more comments from me to set the scene for us. And this is not new information to a lot on the call, but we are living certainly in unprecedented times, seeing rising geopolitical conflicts, climate change, food insecurity, all of which can reverse the gains we have made in the past few decades in addressing poverty. And at the same time, overseas development aid is being reduced. Globally, 308 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance across 73 countries. And this is a number that continues to rise. Drastic cuts in foreign aid are becoming increasingly common among major donors in Europe and the US, with a direct impact on vulnerable populations. In France, the government recently announced further cuts of 700 million euros in its official development assistance, or ODA, in early July to help reduce the public deficit. In the UK, the decision was taken in February to reduce ODA from 0.7% to 0.3% of GDP, starting in 2027, and that's accompanied by an increase in military spending. We see similar trends in Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and of course in the US, AID was dismantled earlier this year. The result is that we are seeing 40% less funding than we did a year ago. But I do want to share one bright spot. According to the Giving USA report, Charitable giving by individuals in the US reached a high last year of $392.45 billion. That's an increase of 8.2% in current dollars and 5.1% when adjusted for inflation. Individuals remain the largest source of giving, accounting for 66% of total contributions. And notably, giving to international affairs causes across all sectors of private charity increased by over 14% last year. So that's the bright spot. The challenge is that still this category of international affairs giving remains very low as a total piece of the pie at about 6%. And at the same time, we are seeing rising needs for philanthropy in the US to fill growing gaps in healthcare and other basic needs assistance as programs are slashed. All of this, of course, raises many questions and brings us here today. Who is left out and how are they impacted? How do we deal with continuity risks for some providers? And most importantly, where are alternate sources of capital? Where are opportunities for change and for reframing expectations? So we'll turn now to our panel. Emmanuel, let's first turn to you to share trends from the CGAP Funder Survey.
Yes. Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation. I will be using the last CGAP Funder Survey as a base for this presentation. And I need to precise that the Funder Survey, the last one, dates back to 2022. And I will be using this to assess the vulnerabilities of the inclusive finance sectors into the current shifts in ODA patterns that you already alluded to, Erica. So just a little reminder that CGAP has been conducting this funder survey annually or biannually since 2008, with the idea to provide insights into the global financing inclusion programming. It captures primary sources of international cross-border commitments. It's not disbursements, right? And it excludes intermediary or secondary flows. So it really looks at the first place where the funding is going. The survey is based primarily on self-reported data and during project-level data that CGAP gathers from its members, and they are aggregated for analysis. It's complemented by desk research and qualitative insights that are gathered through direct engagement with the funders. In this presentation, I will focus on the public funders, but we partner with Tameo on these surveys to provide a highlight on what the private flows are as well to the inclusive finance sector. But Anne will be talking more about them. So the last data we have, and sorry, let me move this. Here we go. So the last data we have, which is from 2022, shows that the public financing for inclusive finance was reaching $49 billion of commitments, and which was an increase of 8% compared to 2021. Obviously, as you alluded to, Erica, a lot has happened since 2022, and we don't have the precise data. What we know, and I would just like to indeed maybe repeat a few things that you've mentioned, but to make sure that we have the right the full landscape. So what we know is that from 2022, ODA has continued to rise, continued its trend of rising, and it rose roughly by 10% overall, not specifically to inclusive finance. But we also know that this increase was notably reflecting in-country refugee expenses and support to Ukraine. So it was not necessarily a huge increase to other more usual topics. And then in 2024, ODA began to decline with a slight decline by roughly 7% overall. And then further announcements of other cuts by, as you were mentioning, US, UK, Germany, and France, which are some of the very largest donors. And what we are expecting for 25 is a decrease overall by 9 to 17% in the number, in the figure of ODA, and a cumulative drop from 24 to 26 due to the future, the announced future drops of a total of 25% from 24 to 26. And to complement and to go back to the figure that you cited of 40%, this is also linked to this further and higher decrease that we all feel, is linked to the fact that there is a reduced amount and also a change in the places where the money is going, and notably more going to different topics than before, and less to the usual spending, and notably more pressure from all countries to have their own development assistance supporting their own economy, and hence going to different priorities. All that to say, this is definitely for sure a decrease in financing that we're going to see. Now the question is, what does this mean for inclusive finance? That's the point of this presentation. And so to assess the potential vulnerabilities, what I'm going to look at first is where the funding was going back in 2022. And so, as you can see here on this slide, 67% of the commitments came from DFIs, and as a result, with a strong focus on debt financing as dominating the public funding, 70% of public funding going to debt financing, and a very significant share going directly to FSPs, 56%. The relatively good news there is that this type of funding is generally less sensitive to ODA fluctuations, even though the most concessional forms of DFI financing, so the one going to operations in the most fragile or frontier countries, might still be affected, but definitely to a lower extent than pure grant. Now, if we look at the grant funding, which we see here is 12% of the total financing for inclusive finance, and we look at its composition, here we see that bilateral donors are the primary providers of grants, which is not a surprise, and it is typically directed rather to support functions, market building, capacity building, and policy work, rather than directly going to financial service providers. We also see that Africa is the main recipient of that type of grant funding. And now, when going a slight bit deeper in the data and looking at the areas of vulnerability that might emerge when we combine this composition of funding and the trends of the funding of the different donors and their thematic and geographic focus, here are the few highlights that we can point to. First of all, is grant funding is very concentrated, with 7 donors accounting for 7% of the total grant funding. One thing that is relatively positive is that actually out of those 7 donors, quite a few are not seeing massive, drastic reductions, at least yet, in the announcements, and hence the average budget reduction that we see for the inclusive finance sector based on this and on these top 7 donors is roughly 15%. Sorry, so we think that the grant funding for inclusive finance is a bit less affected than the overall pattern. That's at least the anticipation. Then one thing that is important to remind is that there are 4 donors that represent the largest announced cuts. So the US, UK, Germany, and France, however, still represent 45% of the total grant financing. So, they are severely affected, but there is another 50% of the financing which is much less affected, almost not, leading to this 15% in average of reduction. Then, when we look more specifically at the geographic composition of the financing, we see that 25 countries appear to be particularly vulnerable to the shifts in donor spending. And this is because these countries show a much higher grant per adult kind of ratio. So meaning that it's much more important for their economies and for their local financial inclusive finance sector. And that they also have, those are countries that also have lower levels of domestic deposits and credits as percentage of GDP, meaning much narrower financial sectors overall, putting an even higher importance to the inclusive finance sector. And that they also usually, those 25 countries have also relatively low or very low sovereign ratings, meaning that for them to access international financing on a private commercial basis is relatively difficult. So those 25 countries are also for most of them, categorized as fragile. I think that's no surprise. And so, and these actually concentrate only on 20% of the grant funding, but we think that this 20% is one that really needs to, hopefully stay, and because those countries will have high difficulties replacing it. Among those countries, I want to just cite 10 probably. So I think we have Mozambique, Mali, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Syria, Myanmar, Sudan, Niger, Pakistan. All those, I guess, from the names, that indeed programs of grant financing for inclusive finance that go to those countries definitely are exceptionally key for the stability of the financial sectors there. That's one bucket. The other bucket is countries such as Egypt, Tunisia, Colombia, or Guatemala, where the financing from the donors that are with the largest announced cuts were quite concentrated, and where there is relatively low support from other countries. And so these countries may face reductions of ODA and grant funding that is in the range of 30 to 50%. So that's another source of concern. It's concentration of grant funding from those highly affected donors in those specific countries. And I think that will be to be watched. The last point on the theme is the fact that the thematic areas that are the most reliant on donor funding and grant funding, and the ones with specifically high budget cuts, are the following areas: support to migrants and refugees and displaced persons, where we know there is huge needs and that the needs are not slowing down. Second is the green transition and climate initiatives, another area where we know that the urgency is not reducing. And the third one is water, sanitation, and housing. So, those very fragile countries, those countries that were very dependent on grant funding from those specific donors that have cuts, and those thematic areas seem to be the most vulnerable to those shifts, and hopefully the ones where the donors will have the highest attention. And we know that it's definitely not an easy task for the donors to select from all the priorities that exist. But this is, food for thought there. And the last piece is, I know that there is a survey that is being, that will likely be published relatively soon by Grameen Crédit Agricole Foundation, where they've surveyed FSPs to understand how they were affected. And I think that will be a very interesting way to check whether those trends that we identified from this concentration of financing, whether those trends are actually verified. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Emmanuelle. And turning to you to give us the perspective from the private sector. So Timeo publishes the Private Asset Impact Report annually. What trends are you seeing there, and how do you think this will affect inclusive finance and funding for the most vulnerable populations?
Yes, thank you, Erika. So in our flagship report, we explore the market of impact funds, which are investing in emerging and frontier economies, mainly through private debt and private equity. And at the end of 2024, we estimate this market at around 103.7 billion USD. Across roughly 800 funds that are managed by more than 450 managers. So this is just to give a bit of context. And we are currently revising these figures for 2025. So one important thing that we see is that investment managers, they are really mainly concentrated in developed markets. And about 3/4 of the total assets, they are managed out of North America and Western Europe. We are seeing more local managers emerging as well in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, but the largest flows, they continue to originate from the United States, Switzerland, the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, and France, but also with some regional hubs that we see, such as Singapore, India, of course, South Africa, and Brazil. In terms now of the funds that have been launched every year, so we see that around 70 new funds are launched each year in the last 10 years about. And we see that the landscape is clearly diversifying, so really moving beyond microfinance to include more climate and energy strategy, as well as multi-sector strategies. But it's quite important to keep in mind that the multi-sector, they still include investment that are aimed at financial, promoting financial inclusion in various share, and also supporting adjacent sectors such as food and agriculture. And now just a word on asset growth dynamics. So in 2023, and we are closing the data collection for 2024, but this figure will be really soon. But in 2023, we see that the private asset impact funds, they saw only a modest growth of just 1.2% year on year. And it's actually quite, it's slightly negative for microfinance funds only. The fundraising was particularly challenging, especially for open-ended funds, in contrast to closed-ended funds, which have experienced net outflows. But despite this, I think it's still important to say that the financial returns, we saw that they were holding up with the performance that remained resilient during these difficult times. In terms of anticipation, so mid-2024, the fund manager, they expected a modest rebound for the year, but this is to be confirmed with the actual data that is coming, because the tensions, they continued to increase. And then just in terms of the interest rate environment, that is also a major challenge since 2022. So the rising rates, they have affected the fundraising landscape. And especially as investors, they still perceive emerging market as a high risk. So these funds, they have responded to this environment by adjusting their lending models. They have raised portfolio yields, and notably by using more floating rate instruments to really stay aligned with the broader market trends. And finally, just on the funding side, we see that institutional investors, they remain the largest source of capital. They represent just over half of the market. And what's notable too, it's that public funders, their share is actually growing. So this likely reflects the challenging fundraising environment, with the public funders stepping in to fill part of the funding gap, which includes investing in senior tranches, for example. And I think in the current foreign aid context, it's also important to note that the sector which are adjacent to microfinance, so as I said, food and agriculture or climate and energy, they also still heavily relying on public funding. So to just sum up these few trends, the private asset impact fund landscape is substantial, and it continues to grow, but at a modest pace recently. And the investment managers, they are still concentrated mainly in developed markets, but we see more local managers as well emerging. And on the funding side, the institutional investor, they remain the largest investor group, yet the public funders are playing an increasingly important role, stepping in when needed. So these are the key trends that we'll continue to monitor as we update our figures for this year's edition.
Great. Thank you so much for that summary. That's so insightful. And I just want to point to Jayshree's good question about gender that was directed originally to Emmanuel, but I think maybe Emmanuel and Anne, maybe you could both reflect on that. I don't know if you wanted to add anything right now in terms of some of the countries and gender disparities and the assumption of greater impact, negative impact on women, or we can hold that and discuss it as a group to follow everyone's comments. There's a question about gender and some of the countries and related to the latest Findex report as well. So we can keep moving along, but I just want to flag that and we'll come back to it. So let's move now to Meta. Meta, could you describe some of your work and thoughts on the funding landscape? I know, rising hedging costs are a huge concern, the ongoing challenge of, underdeveloped local capital markets. Obviously, what we just heard from Anne and Emmanuel are I know, really on your mind, but share some of your thoughts.
Thanks so much, Erica. So I'll first share with you the context in which we operate. So Microloan Foundation, Erica, as you mentioned, works in 4 geographies. So we work in Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe. We recently launched in South Africa. These markets have unique challenges. They're characterized by macroeconomic shocks, political uncertainty, limited infrastructure, high levels of poverty, and some tricky regulatory landscapes. And you add to this the cascading effects of climate change, and you can just begin to imagine the complexity of delivering financial services in these regions. I mean, Emmanuel mentioned some fragile markets. I would argue that, you didn't mention Malawi and Zim, but I would, in your list, you had a subset of countries that you mentioned, but we would very much advocate that these are fragile markets. So while all of these markets present these challenges, some of our markets are more challenging than others. So just to give you some perspective, in Malawi, for example, we have witnessed an overnight devaluation of 42%. We also see increasingly, climate change, the effects of climate change, floods and natural disasters are very commonplace. And in Malawi, we've also seen a prolonged period of foreign exchange security. It's something like 1 month's reserves with the Treasury. So this is a very dire situation. And so financial institution providers like ourselves find it really difficult to plan and provide sustained support to the end clients. So what does it mean for last mile financial service institutions such as ours? When we say last mile, we believe we're truly last mile. We work in some of the most underserved regions of the country. We are 100% focused on women because we know that that's where there are significant gaps in financial inclusion in these geographies. And just to put into context, our average loan size can be anywhere between $65 to $80, and our starting loan size can be as low as $35. So that indicates the depth of outreach we have in these geographies. And so we also have, as a result, consequently, a very high-touch operating model. What that means is, where we go into the fields to deliver financial services and literacy training to these clients. And we've seen over 2 decades of experience has demonstrated that has yielded to better repayment rates, higher levels of financial literacy, and ultimately enables us as institutions to better listen to our clients and adapt products. But what this means is the operating cost structure is very high, consequently. We've invested in technology, but technology is not that, magic button that washes away the operating costs. In fact, investing in technology for the last mile is proven to be really expensive. It's a worthwhile endeavor, but it requires time, effort, and financial resources to get it right. So over the years, increasingly, we've also relied on social impact, social investors and impact investors to finance the growth in our loan capital. I can safely say majority of these investors are outside Africa. So these loans are sourced in hard currency. And consequently, we're facing the increasing risks of high hedging costs because of the macroeconomic uncertainty we operate in. In Malawi, for example, recently we've secured a loan at 30% interest rate per annum. That is astronomical because of the perceived macroeconomic stability and political uncertainty that exists in these countries. So even though these loans are denominated in local currency, the hedging costs make the overall lending structure more expensive than even commercial rates. And this is despite the social mandates, despite the high impact mandate that many of these lenders have. So who ultimately bears the brunt of these costs? It is last mile financial institutions such as ourselves, But also, more importantly, it is the end clients that we serve, because with such high costs and finance costs being a very important line in our P&L, it means that we were not able to do more to reduce the cost of borrowing for the clients who actually need it the most. These are clients who are extremely vulnerable to all of these shocks, including the effects of climate change, and need more support in terms of reduced cost of borrowing. But yet they face one of the highest costs of borrowing globally because of the funding structure. So this is where the conversation needs to shift. We need to move from more commercial to patient long-term funding. We need local banks to do more. Like I said earlier, most of our capital is being sourced from overseas, from outside Africa. Local capital mobilization has to happen, and they need to be able to support last mile financial institutions like us. More importantly, the role of subsidy and philanthropy, we should not shy away from that role, because it is needed now more so than ever in these fragile markets that we operate, because the odds are stacked against these institutions and the clients. So we must ask ourselves, how do we continue to commercialize when the ecosystem itself is failing? And so it involves recognizing the ground realities and prioritizing impact over returns. Because I think ultimately, and I'm sure all my panelists will also agree, fellow panelists will agree, that financial inclusion is not just about financial access. It is about affordability. It is about resilience and ultimately dignity to the end clients. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meta. That's really sobering to hear in some sense, and we're so grateful for your work. And maybe you can also, after we hear from Liz, maybe pick up on the a little bit more of the conversation around gender. Liz, let's turn to you. You've advised and mobilized philanthropic capital to underserved regions in the world. Kind of a leading question: Is there a role for philanthropic donors to step into this vacuum? And what are some shifting trends that you've seen with donors you advise, especially in this world with growing risks and uncertainty?
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for including me, Erica, in this conversation. The comments earlier have been very sobering, but philanthropy does have a role to play. Its power is in its ability to step in where markets and governments can't or won't. Taking risks, seeding innovation, supporting local leaders. What I see now is a shift from short-term contributions to solving complex social problems by addressing root causes and transforming the underlying structures rather than treating the symptoms. Some donors are beginning to consider blending philanthropic capital with other investment options, trying to motivate other funders to consider trusting communities and leading into the risk where it's needed most. Philanthropy is evolving to meet the uncertainty with courage and integrity, I believe. Philanthropy in places where governments and markets won't reach can be catalytic. They can take risks and seed innovations and support local organizations. And local organizations are where the changes are going to occur. It's philanthropic flexibility, values-driven, seeing the urgent needs on the ground that's going to lay the foundation for systems and structures that can sustain communities in the future. So what I'm seeing amongst donors is a shift. First, there's a move from charity towards system change investments that involves shifting this is going to be a hard one, fundamental policies, mindsets, relationships, and power dynamics throughout the system to collaborate to create new and more effective and lasting systems. That's when I think about how some of Accion's work that I've witnessed and participated in, that's what I see. Second, there's a growing recognition that local leaders know best. So we're seeing more trust-based investments, and this is very, very hard for groups that are used to vetting everything. that's going to just delay things and not get the money where it's needed most, or the product or the projects. So we're seeing flexible funding going directly to community-based organizations. And this is where, whether it's an individual, a foundation, a corporation, donors want to see the full arc of an organization's work through the impact on one person, one family, or a community. Everybody's spent years with data, and now people want to see what happened. How did that actually have an impact? What policy change did that make so that that community can actually get the resources they need, or the education, or the medical care, whatever it is that they need? They want to connect to the groups they fund in a very concrete manner to understand the work and the needs of the organizations and of the people that are impacted by that work. So, and importantly, in a world of rising risks, and we have a lot of them, from climate shocks to political instability, donors are not retreating. They're leaning in thoughtfully. They're beginning to view risk as an indicator of where their dollars are needed most, rather than something to shy away from. That, coupled with a sharper focus on outcomes and transparency on an individual basis, tells me philanthropy is evolving in real time to meet this moment of uncertainty with courage and innovation. And I'm going to sort of pop in, and Erica had posed a question about a call to action. And my call to action to everyone out there listening is that help donors see the power and the value of giving local actors funds directly, and educating them or creating skill sets, programs, in order for them to make the systemic change that's needed and to push public policy forward accordingly. It's going to start at the ground. It's just really hard for governmental policy groups in large parts of, let's say, Africa, within those countries, to see their way down to the very local level. It's easier for the local level to educate them and move everybody forward. And I'm not saying that's actually easy, but it's really important.
Oh, thank you, Liz. That's a wonderful call to action, and it resonates with some comments and conversations I heard at a recent gathering of international donors, where people, there's a call to action to mobilize philanthropic assets, right? There's a lot of money sitting on the sidelines, and people, are now paralyzed because of regulatory environment and not wanting to step afoul of potential future rules in this administration. And now is the time to act, right? Times just like these, right? I mean, someone said, what is a rainy day fund useful for, right? If not actually used when it rains. And I do think this, really, really is a moment where I certainly have started to see, and hope we can continue to see, people stepping up and like you said, working together, right? So that we're telling a better story, right? And that impact, and helping donors see that, right? And helping donors to move quickly. And boy, Medha, I bet you could articulate, right, some of the gaps, right, that that could be filled, right, by thoughtful philanthropic capital. Thanks so much, Liz. Well, Liz, as suspected, we're close to 5 minutes to time. I knew this would go quickly, and thank you, everyone, for your great comments. I do want to just go back around the panel. Anyone else want to jump in with something for the audience to take away, or a call to action that resonates with you or that you see in your work?
Yeah, I can jump in quickly, riding on the same comment that Liz made. Because I think my call to action is sort of two-pronged. It's really two calls, but interrelated. So I think I would say champion flexibility in how you deploy capital. So champion flexible capital, but also coordinated action. And I'll explain each in turn. So when we say champion flexibility is how we deploy capital. I think the environments we work in are unpredictable, and rigid funding structures actually often do more harm than good. So we need to advocate for capital that can adapt to shocks, that can allow and support experimentation, that can allow for course correction. And if we can make flexibility the norm, I think we'll be better able to weather the volatility and drive real impact. And the second related point is for different players in the funding space to act like a coordinated team. Right now, I think too many funders are backing the same types of interventions, often at the institutional level, while critical gaps, go unfunded. So to drive real impact, we need differentiated roles, not duplication. And some funders, focusing on policy and regulatory reform, others on local capital mobilization. And I think maybe Emmanuel mentioned this, but there are not as many funding the last mile institutions, the institutions serving the very last mile. I mean, they just don't have the buffer because the space has become increasingly commercialized. So these elements must work together, not in isolation. And I think that's how we can drive meaningful change.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Anne?
Yes, thank you. For me, what really resonates is the local actors. I think that we need to go more to bring more capital to these actors, but also maybe thinking of some tech actors which are not part of the usual what we call impact space, and how we can bring awareness to them and also encourage them to adopt best practices in terms of impact and really, these actors are really important, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Emmanuel, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, just probably echoing what some of the points that were already said, but just reinforcing them. I think the call for coordination is the huge one. I think we know that in times of nice, shiny and sunny weather, plants grow and can compete with each other. But when it's dark and cold, and maybe we just need to collaborate for people to be able to stand on their feet for the future. So I think collaboration is very key, making sure that each player is indeed in the right spot with what they can do and they are uniquely positioned to do. So I think definitely there is some space for purely private commercial actors in some places, and others where blending is needed to do local currency for sure, to cover country risk for sure, and also to incentivize FSPs indeed to go for the last mile through. And there are tools for those different mechanisms. And I think just the last thing that I was initially saying is indeed, I think there is the need for grants to remain in some of those places, the very fragile countries. Some of those topics that are only manageable through grants, or especially through grants. I mean, all the things related to refugees, definitely, and also making sure that innovation, which is difficult to do and is still needed to be as efficient as we can, continues to be financed through that moment. I think we do need innovation to continue and not stall. And on the gender issue that was raised earlier, certainly this is one of the many topics that could go backwards. It's definitely not the only one, but it could. Yeah. So be careful.
Yeah, we don't want to backslide any further. And maybe I'll just add, on the flip side of that, the gender inequality, in the U.S. or in the, Western economies, we are seeing, and Liz, maybe you can speak very briefly to this, or maybe it's just food for thought, but we are seeing a lot more power, female philanthropists, right? Really on the rise and really, speaking with their pocketbooks. And really doing a lot of innovative work, and I think we've touched on some of this. So that's something that I think we can also continue to look at, and hopefully that will help affect some change in the philanthropic space.
Yeah, Erica, I think you're absolutely right. Women are really standing up, and they really are very clear about how they want their money invested, and they're very concerned about women being part of that conversation, not just as a donor, but as the end recipient and impact, the impact that they get in countries where it's needed most.
Where it's needed. Absolutely, absolutely. And as we run down the clock here, maybe I'll just, I recently heard Samantha Power speak, and I'll quote her. She gave a really nice talk and ended with, a theme of better is good, right? Take action, and really let's push on all cylinders here. I love that champions of flexibility and that coordination, that call for coordination, right? We need to work together. Great. Well, I want to thank everyone. I think we are right at time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and for your thoughtful comments and for the incredible work that you do every day.